It started so innocently, didn't it? Just a friendship. All I ever needed was to feel heard, to feel valued. My wife, later, she tried to justify her cheating. But when the truth finally exploded and I confronted her, she actually tried to twist it, blaming my own insecurities like I was the villain in her secret drama, until I finally found the strength and told her to pack her things and leave. The discovery began on a Friday when I got home way earlier than anyone expected. There wasn't some hidden reason for it. Thank God. The boss just gave us all the afternoon off after lunch, saying we'd earned it. It was brutal hot. It was payday, the end of the month, and all I truly wanted was to collapse onto the couch, crack open a cold beer, and just watch the game in peace. It had been a week of pure hell at work. Endless client complaints, budgets that refused to balance, and a ton of coworkers who were masters of slacking off. Nothing new, but still, getting home 2 hours early felt like a true gift. I pulled the car into the garage, silent, just like always. I didn't even bother with the radio. I craved absolute silence. The plan was dead simple. Ice-cold beer, my shorts, the couch. But the moment I stepped inside, something hit me, a sensation so unnerving, so wrong. It didn't carry the usual scent of food, or coffee, or even Clara's signature floral perfume. There was another smell, distinctly masculine, not from an air freshener or laundry softener. Something raw, something foreign. And yes, this sounds absolutely unhinged, but I felt it, deep in my gut. It was that specific feeling you get when you walk into an empty gym locker room, and you just know someone else had been there seconds before you arrived. Exactly like that. Silence. The living room was empty. Clara's car wasn't in the driveway, but she sometimes parked down the street, so that wasn't unusual. I remembered Paula, our daughter, was safely at a friend's house. I headed upstairs. The bedroom door was slightly open. I strained to listen, but there were no voices, no nervous laughter, no compromising sounds at all. Nothing. Everything was bathed in a silence that felt unnaturally, suspiciously clean. I moved closer, not really thinking yet. Just that awful sense that something is deeply wrong, but you haven't put your finger on the disaster yet. I pushed the bedroom door all the way open and saw the first small, devastating clue. A tie, hanging from the window handle. Definitely not mine. It was striped, one of those expensive, thin, good brand ones. I hadn't put on a tie in years, not since my nephew's baptism. I reached for it. It was still faintly warm, like someone had literally just tossed it there. That's when my jaw clenched. I looked around. The bed was too perfect, flawlessly made, the pillows arranged just so. But on the nightstand, there was a single glass with a faint trace of lipstick. Not red, but that deep wine color Clara only wears for special dinners. I kept moving through the house like a ghost, completely disconnected. I wasn't looking for Clara anymore. I was desperately searching for something to prove I was going crazy, or, worse, to confirm that something horrible had unfolded in my own bed. I went into the bathroom. 2 damp towels were hanging up, one clearly much larger than the other. And there they were, 2 toothbrushes. The old blue one, mine, and another white, brand new, expensive electric model. Since when did Clara own one of those? It wasn't hers, and I knew it instantly. In that sterile bathroom, with the quiet hum of the exhaust fan and the faint smell of men's shower gel hanging in the air, I simply sat down on the edge of the bathtub. I didn't feel the rage yet, just a hollow emptiness, like a switch had been flipped and my insides had powered down. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't check anything on her phone. I went back downstairs, opened the beer I'd been craving all morning, and sat in the living room in that terrible silence. I drank the entire thing slowly, never looking at my phone or the TV, just listening to the loud ticking of the wall clock and waiting. Around 7 o'clock, I heard the front door open. Clara walked in, alone, holding a single grocery bag. She smiled when she saw me, acting as if everything was normal, as if I were just a harmless piece of furniture in the room. "You're home already?" she asked, putting on a show of surprise. I looked at her. I stared. I really stared at her for the first time in what felt like forever. Not the quick, superficial glance you give someone you see every day. I looked at her like she was a complete stranger. And right then, I couldn't decide what was worse, the crushing suspicion I harbored, or the terrifying calm with which she pretended nothing was amiss. When I woke up the next morning, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted inside me. It wasn't anger or jealousy, or even sadness, not yet. It was more like a thick blindfold I'd worn for years had been violently ripped away. And for the first time, I saw everything in a brutal, clear light. Clara was downstairs, making coffee in the kitchen, behaving as if yesterday's discoveries hadn't happened. As if she hadn't carelessly left clues of another person in our house. As if she hadn't been playing the role of the devoted wife for weeks, while rehearsing a whole different script with some other man. She came over, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if I wanted toast. I said no. I sat down at the table, across from her, maintaining a forced calmness, and while she chattered about mundane things, the parent-teacher meeting that afternoon, the birthday party for Paula's friend's father, I watched her. Not with love or tenderness, but with the cold detachment that settles over you when you realize you're facing someone you no longer know at all. She didn't seem to notice anything strange, or she was an astonishing actress. She moved confidently, wearing the same expression as always. She didn't sense, or didn't care, that my gaze was different, that I knew something. And that silence, that knowledge, gave me the control to remain quiet. I went to work, but I didn't actually work. I spent the day locked in the maintenance office, checking parts that were already fine, making empty phone calls, writing emails that required no reply. My only goal was to survive the day without crossing any lines, without saying a word before I was absolutely certain. But the certainty was already humming inside me. You don't need evidence when your entire body screams that it already knows the answer. Still, I decided that if Clara was going to play the game of hiding, I could certainly play the game of uncovering without alerting her. I hated the idea. I've never been the type to rifle through bags or stalk my wife like some cheap detective, but I desperately needed to understand the full story unfolding behind my back. That night, while Clara was in the shower, I seized the chance to check the grocery bag from the previous day. It was empty, but deep at the bottom was a crumpled receipt. It wasn't from our usual neighborhood market. It was from an expensive store downtown, one we rarely went to. The items were listed: 2 bottles of fancy wine, a box of expensive chocolates, and a cedar and amber scented air freshener spray, one we never use at home. Clara never bought that kind of wine. Anyway, I didn't drink wine, and she preferred white. I placed the receipt back exactly as I found it, and said nothing. I sat on the couch, waiting for her to come out. When she emerged, hair damp, wearing her pajamas, she came over and sat next to me. She kissed my neck and asked what I was watching. I clenched my teeth so hard, barely managing a smile, and whispered, "Nothing interesting." She rested her head on my shoulder and stroked my arm. My stomach twisted violently, not from the moment's tenderness, but because I knew this woman pressed against me had just been holding someone else, and now she was using the same intimate gesture as if it were meaningless. The next few days blurred together. Clara suddenly became overly attentive. She'd text me during the day, asking if I needed anything from the supermarket. She'd offer to pick up Paula if my work was busy, but none of it felt like genuine tenderness. It was pure strategy. You could feel it in the strained way she spoke, as if she was trying too hard to rise above any suspicion, trying to quickly redraw an image I could no longer accept. One Tuesday, she told me she'd be a little late because of a staff meeting. I asked what time she'd be back. She said around 9 o'clock, no later. At 9:15, she walked through the door. Her hair was slightly mussed. The collar of her shirt was open a bit too far, and she was wearing that heavy perfume she hadn't touched in months. I asked if the meeting went well, and she answered yes, that it was terribly long and boring. She told me this while pouring a glass of water, her back to me, and in that instant, I knew she was lying. I decided to take the game to her. The following Thursday, I told her I'd be late, too, that the guys from work wanted to grab some beers. It was a complete lie, but I needed to see her reaction. She said that was great, I should have fun, and she'd use the time to tidy up the house. I left around 7 o'clock, and instead of driving to the bar, I parked 2 streets away and settled in to wait. It was dark and chilly, but I didn't care about the cold. I needed to know if her meetings were real or if she was using our routine as her perfect alibi. At 7:55, I saw her car pull out of the driveway. She wasn't alone. There was a man in the passenger seat. I couldn't make out his face. The car turned toward the neighborhood exit, and I followed, keeping a slow, cautious distance. She drove to a large apartment building near the river. She double-parked, and they both got out. He used a key to open the building's main door. She followed him inside. They weren't carrying folders or work bags, and they certainly weren't acting like school colleagues. They moved with the familiar calmness of people who have repeated this ritual countless times. I stayed absolutely still in my car, frozen, unable to decide if I wanted to break down and cry, scream until my lungs gave out, or just laugh at the grotesque absurdity of it all. Because in that single, gut-wrenching instant, all room for doubt was gone. Clara was seriously involved with another man. This wasn't a drunken mistake or a silly little fling. It was something structured, organized, established. I got back home an hour later. Paula was sound asleep. I stepped into the shower, and that's where I finally broke down a little. I didn't cry like a child, but my body felt heavier than it ever had before. I stared at myself in the mirror and didn't see a cheated husband. I saw a man whose entire story had been dismantled without so much as a warning. I slipped into bed without making a sound. Clara returned close to midnight. She gently touched my shoulder to signal she was home. I pretended to be deep asleep. I felt her body settle next to mine, her breathing calm and steady. She slept as if she were utterly innocent, as if the world was still in perfect order. And for the first time, I began to think that maybe I shouldn't pretend any longer. But I wasn't going to say anything yet. Not until I had a plan. Not until I understood exactly how far Clara had gone and what role she still intended to play in our lives. Because if she had made her decisions, I was certainly beginning to prepare mine. When I woke up the next morning, I couldn't keep it all bottled up anymore. My mental space was gone. I had tolerated too much, and every small gesture Clara made bounced inside me with an intensity that felt like a series of undefendable punches. I got up before her and ate breakfast alone in the kitchen, no radio, no phone, thinking about nothing except the conversation I'd been avoiding for days. I knew today had to be the day I stopped watching and started talking. But I wouldn't approach her like a madman, or a desperate husband, or someone begging for pathetic explanations. I would do it like a man who had seen enough. Clara came downstairs around 9 o'clock, her hair half wet, wearing that serene expression she uses when she believes she controls every single detail of her life. She said good morning and asked if I'd like to go out for lunch on Sunday. Normally, that would have sounded sweet, but that day it felt like a cynical attempt to force a normality that had been dead for days. I told her we could see, and she smiled, though I'm sure she was already noticing the different tone in my voice. We spent some time doing things around the house. I organized tools in the garage. She put away laundry in the bedroom. The tension was palpable. Every time we passed near each other, there was this uncomfortable, thick distance. It wasn't because we were actively angry, but because we both knew there was a dangerous truth hanging in the air that couldn't stay hidden much longer. Mid-morning, I went up to our room and found her folding t-shirts on the bed. She looked calm, but her shoulders were rigid, and when she saw me enter, her hands immediately stopped moving. I leaned against the door frame, not rushing, breathing slowly. She asked if something was wrong. I said yes, that we needed to talk. She folded the t-shirt she was holding with exaggerated precision, stood up, and looked at me as if trying to guess where I would start. I didn't give her time to invent a single thing. I told her I knew she hadn't been at a school meeting on Thursday, that I had followed her car, and I had seen the man she walked into that building with. I kept my voice low. I didn't yell. I didn't make any dramatic accusations. I simply stated the facts of what I had witnessed. She froze for a few seconds, too still, as if mentally shuffling her entire story to respond as fast as possible. When she spoke, her voice was much louder than I expected. She immediately said she couldn't believe I'd actually followed her, that it was disrespectful, that a relationship couldn't be built on such behavior. I let her vent all the outrage she wanted, because I didn't care about her offense. I cared about the raw truth she was trying to hide behind that attack. When she finally stopped, I told her this wasn't about control or jealousy or checking up on her life, but about undeniable, concrete facts. The tie in our bedroom, the damp towels in the bathroom, the toothbrush that wasn't hers, the expensive wine she never buys, the different perfume, the changed schedules, and the man who opened the door with his own key to the building she entered as if it were her second home. She tried desperately to remain calm, but her voice cracked when she told me I was exaggerating, that none of it meant anything, that Thursday was just a meeting at a colleague's house, and the guy I saw was simply a father from the school who had accompanied her to run some errands. I didn't dignify that absurd version with a response. It didn't deserve analysis. I just asked her how she explained the tie in our room. Then, she claimed she didn't know what tie I was talking about. I told her I'd found it myself, that I had held it in my hand. Then, unbelievably, she asked me to show it to her, as if she thought I was making up the whole thing. I knew perfectly well I didn't have to produce the proof. She knew which tie it was. So I simply repeated that I was not willing to play games at that low level. She took a step toward me, her hands trembling slightly, and asked me not to continue the conversation in that tone. I replied that there was no tone, that the only thing I was doing was demanding the truth she had been hiding for far too long. At that point, she looked down. Instead of continuing her denial, she changed her line of attack. She told me that I had been distant lately, that I talked less, that I seemed more concerned with my own things than with us, and that maybe I had misinterpreted many situations because of my own insecurities. It was a sophisticated way to shift the blame, to see if I would just tire of looking for answers. But I was done accepting those maneuvers. I told her I had zero insecurities, that I had always trusted her implicitly, that I had never spied on her, and I had never had any reason to distrust her, but the reasons had started appearing all on their own, without me looking for them. She went silent, and that's when I knew I was about to break through her wall. I asked her directly, "Who was the man you entered that apartment with?" She inhaled deeply, as if gathering the air needed to deploy one final, major lie, or to finally say something true after weeks of deception. She told me he was a colleague from school, that they were working together on a cultural activities project, and the meeting had simply run late. I reminded her that I saw him open the door with his own key, and she went instantly silent. There was no way to justify that. No cultural project explained a key to a private apartment. She looked at me with a horrible mix of nervousness and anger, as if I were the cause of the terrible situation she had created. And then she finally said, "Yes, he was a friend. He lived there, but nothing had happened. They just had to go over some materials, and I didn't want you to misinterpret things." I told her I wasn't misinterpreting anything. I'd been noticing the changes for a long time. The signs were everywhere. I could no longer pretend I didn't see what was right in front of me. She pleaded with me to stop talking, saying she was overwhelmed and didn't want to argue. It was the first time that morning I saw fear on her face. Not fear of me, but fear that the conversation would continue to a point where she couldn't disguise anything further. I told her I didn't want to argue either. I just needed the truth, because continuing to live with lies was pointless. She sank onto the edge of the bed and covered her face with her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, slightly broken. She told me she had never intended to hurt me, that she was confused, that the situation had become complicated without her planning it, and that she honestly didn't know how to stop it without destroying everything. I stood there listening, and that's when she confessed. She didn't use the word directly, but she said something clear enough, that she'd been feeling completely out of place for months, that she'd found support at school in someone who made her feel valued, that the connection with that person had spiraled out of her control, that she didn't want to lose our daughter or me, that she hadn't meant to go this far. She didn't have to say infidelity. She had said it without saying it. I watched her for a long time. I didn't feel relief hearing the confession. Instead, a complex mix of contained rage and absolute exhaustion washed over me, as if everything I'd suspected was confirmed, and I needed no further details. I simply asked her what she planned to do next. Clara had no answer. She told me she needed time. She needed to clear her head. She didn't want to make any rash decisions. I told her, quite frankly, that time had run out the day she decided to cross certain boundaries. What we needed now wasn't time, it was clarity. We sat for a while in a long, heavy silence, the kind that makes it crystal clear that two people are no longer standing on the same ground. She tried to reach out to touch my arm, but I deliberately moved away, not with contempt, but with the coldness born from broken trust, a coldness that prevents you from forcing yourself to react as you once did. She stood up, said she needed to go outside for air, and walked downstairs without looking back at me. I remained in the room, sitting on the edge of the bed where we had shared so much of our lives, thinking about how quickly something that felt so stable could completely collapse. And even though it had been excruciating to hear, there were still tougher conversations ahead. When Clara walked out the door that day, keys in hand, her gaze unfocused on any point but me, I knew a new phase had begun. A phase where asking for explanations or seeking coherence in her words was useless, because coherence had been shattered weeks ago. Now, the only choice was action. I wasn't thinking about quick revenge or drama. I was thinking about restoring balance, because she had been playing with an enormous advantage for too long, and I had essentially been a silent spectator, swallowing every lie with the trusting good faith of someone who believes his home is the safest place in the world. I stayed seated on the bed, staring at the floor, listening to the silence of a room I no longer recognized as truly mine. And though a part of me yearned to run after her and keep fighting, the other part, the one that had grown stronger over the last few days, told me to handle this differently. Smarter, colder, more appropriate for the sheer gravity of the situation. So, I got up, pulled on a sweatshirt, and went to the living room to gather my scattered thoughts without rushing. The first thing I did was review, mentally, everything I had seen in recent weeks, not to punish myself, but to fully grasp how completely she had lost all shame in the secret game she was playing. I recalled the tie, the damp towels, the wrong perfume, the apartment she entered with that man, the excuses she repeated with the same ease one discusses the price of groceries, her involuntary flinch every time I asked a question that made her uncomfortable. It all painted an undeniable picture. Even though she'd avoided using the explicit word, there were no gaps left. The reality was what it was, and I had to position myself correctly to face it. One thing was now crystal clear. If she decided to operate a parallel life, I had every right to protect mine and Paula's. And protecting, in this case, meant making conscious, deliberate decisions, not allowing Clara to continue using our house as a pit stop between two lives, and not letting her believe she could move forward without consequences. As I sat silently in a corner, I spent time planning, and came to a simple decision. I couldn't just wait for her return with a newly polished version of events, or another emotional plea for time. If she needed time, so did I. But my time wouldn't be spent sitting still. I grabbed a backpack and began packing essentials. Personal documents, things that were exclusively mine, work papers, bank cards, a couple of hard drives with all my backups, my most critical work tools, and a few changes of clothes. This wasn't me running away or abandoning my home. It was a strategic opening move. I didn't plan to sleep out that night, but I wanted Clara to see that I was no longer operating under her rules. Above all, I wanted to make it undeniably clear. If she had secrets, I had plans. When I finished, I put the backpack in the car, hiding it under an old blanket, and went back into the house to continue the day as if absolutely nothing had happened. Paula was due home that afternoon, and she couldn't find out anything yet. So, I prepared a snack for her. I helped her with her homework, and we watched TV together for a while. In the meantime, there was still absolute silence from Clara. Not a single text, no phone call, no word. Her silence was practically a full, implicit admission of guilt. At 9:30, she came through the front door. She looked utterly exhausted, her eyes slightly puffy, surely from crying, or perhaps from trying to mentally script what she would say to me. She greeted me with a quiet hello, and went straight to Paula to give her a kiss. I watched her from the couch, unmoving. Once Paula went upstairs to shower, Clara and I were alone in the living room. She remained standing, not sitting down, as if unsure where she belonged anymore. She asked me if I was feeling any better than I had that morning. I told her I was the same, just thinking. She asked if I wanted to talk more. I said I wanted to hear what she finally had to say, but that this time, I needed crystal clear answers, no beating around the bush, and absolutely no attempts to blame me for her actions. She rubbed her hands together, took a deep, shaky breath, and started the speech she had clearly rehearsed. She claimed it hadn't been her intention to let things reach this point, that the relationship with that man had truly started as a mere friendship, that she had been swept away by a feeling of freedom at work because she felt trapped at home, that she had made mistakes, but she insisted she hadn't done anything truly serious, that she just needed to feel heard and valued. That tired, repetitive explanation, full of phrases that attempt to sound sincere but manage to specify nothing. I let her talk, not because I cared about the content, but because I needed to gauge how far she was willing to go to defend herself from the heavy weight of the truth. When she concluded, I asked her point blank, "Are you having a relationship with that man?" She looked down. I saw it as a desperate attempt to soften her answer. She said she wouldn't call it a relationship, that they had shared difficult moments, and she didn't know how to define it. It was her way of acknowledging it without having to fully admit it. That's when I told her I understood what she was trying to do, but I was not willing to participate in her ambiguity. I told her her life was her own to live, but if she had already chosen to share it with another man, I was not going to stick around like a piece of useless furniture in the living room, waiting for her to figure things out. I told her I would not tolerate her using my house to hide her trysts while I slept next to a woman who was blatantly lying to me. She put her hands to her face and started to cry, not with deep, wrenching sobs, but that restrained kind of crying meant to elicit pity. She begged me not to make any rash decisions, that she didn't want to break up our family, that she needed time to fix things. I shot back that things aren't fixed by hiding other people's keys or bringing another man into an apartment behind your husband's back. She said she understood my anger, that she was deeply sorry, but she didn't want me to react destructively. That word, destructively, actually made me laugh, not out of humor, but out of sheer, hollow disbelief, because she was the one who had already made all the destructive decisions without ever consulting me. When she tried to come closer to hug me, I took a hard step back. I told her that was proof we had crossed an irreversible boundary, because before, I would have hugged her without hesitation, but now, her touch produced a visceral repulsion in me. I asked her for the simple honesty she still wouldn't give. "Are you still seeing that man?" She didn't answer. That silence was louder than any confession. I told her that as long as she was unable to completely cut off that situation, I would not continue to share a roof with her, as if nothing was wrong. She asked if I was planning to leave. I told her not yet, but I was immediately beginning to organize my life without her input, because I refused to let her keep making decisions for both of us without my consent. She started begging me, pleading with me to talk over the weekend, to seek professional help, to try to rebuild something. I replied that I wasn't going to rebuild anything with someone who couldn't even acknowledge the ruin we were standing in. Clara spent that night on the couch, not because I ordered her there, but because she finally understood she no longer had the right to climb into the bed she had defiled with her lies. I slept in the bedroom, although it was more of a simulation of sleep than any actual rest. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about every sign I'd carelessly ignored, about how I had allowed her double life to flourish without intervention, and how my shock had transformed into a useful, cold clarity that helped me make decisions with more certainty than ever before. The next morning, when I came downstairs, Clara was gone. On the table was a note, written in the small, cramped handwriting she uses when she's nervous. It said she had gone to her sister's house and would be back in the afternoon to talk. I left it there, untouched. I didn't need a note to know the next conversation would be even harder than the last, and that from this day forward, my actions would no longer depend on her explanations, but solely on what I chose to do with everything she had destroyed. I deliberately avoided thinking about Clara's note all morning. Honestly, I had zero interest in what she had to say or the tone she would use to deliver it. I had heard her version, and I needed no more empty explanations. I wasn't going to allow her to continue shaping the situation to her liking, pretending she still had any control over what was happening in our house. I showered, ate breakfast, and left with one singular goal: to begin executing the plan I'd been quietly preparing for days. This was not impulsive revenge or an emotional outburst. It was a concrete, calculated response to a betrayal that was constant and premeditated, not an isolated mistake or a poorly managed marriage crisis. I went downtown. I stopped by the notary's office, then the office of a friend who had always promised help if I needed it. And finally, I sat alone with a coffee, reviewing every single point of what I needed to do to cut off any financial or legal advantage Clara might have over me. The first step was reviewing the joint accounts. Not because I feared she'd empty them, but because it made no sense to keep mixed what we once shared and now clearly did not. We had a common account for household expenses, another for family savings, and I had my own personal one, maintained for years. I decided to pull my proportional share of the savings, move it to my private account, and leave just enough in the joint account to cover the month's expenses. I refused to let Paula be harmed by a fight she didn't cause. Next, I called the manager of the apartment we'd bought 3 years ago as an investment, a beach property we rented seasonally. I had always handled every detail of that property, and the income went into the common account. I instructed the manager that, beginning next month, the income must be deposited into a different account, exclusively in my name. He confirmed there was no issue. He just needed the signed paperwork, which I promised to have to him in less than 48 hours. Then, I called Tomas, a lawyer I trusted who had been my contact for years on minor legal issues. I asked for an urgent meeting. He fit me in that same afternoon. We sat in his office, and I laid everything out plainly, no embellishments. I told him I wasn't ready to initiate separation proceedings yet, but I needed to know exactly what steps to take if I decided to take the final plunge in the coming days. He asked about the infidelity. I confirmed it, though I lacked formal, photographic proof. He explained that while adultery no longer carries the legal weight it once did in separation cases, having clear indications could certainly help if things got nasty. I asked him how to prevent Clara from potentially keeping assets that weren't strictly hers, or using Paula as a manipulative argument. He explained the possibilities, requested some documents, and advised me to immediately start keeping a written record of all important movements and interactions. Before I left, I also asked him to prepare a draft of a separation agreement, one that would give me a clear room to maneuver and reflect the non-negotiable conditions I was willing to accept. After that meeting, I drove home feeling calmer. Not satisfied. This was no victory, but with a different kind of sensation, as if I were finally taking useful action to defend what was rightfully mine. Clara hadn't returned yet, and Paula was still at her friend's house. I had time to review my notes, make a few more necessary calls, prepare folders with copies of key documents, and write down several passwords I intended to change in the near future. I spent hours on this work, refusing to leave anything to chance. Clara had banked on ambiguity for weeks, but I would not play that game. I was going to be clear, direct, and incredibly difficult to handle. At 7:30, the doorbell rang. It was her, carrying a small bag and wearing the same tired expression, a mixture of discomfort and forced normality. She walked in without speaking, dropped the bag by the entryway, and stood there, waiting for me to start. I didn't speak immediately. I went to the kitchen, made a coffee for myself, and when I returned to the living room, I asked if she wanted one. She declined. Then I asked her to sit down. She perched on the very edge of the sofa, ready to spring up at any moment. I sat across from her and got straight to the point. I told her that for weeks I had tried to have a clean, honest conversation without shouting, without threats, without humiliation. But now, the time for talking was over, and what was coming next was something else entirely. I told her I had been with the lawyer, that I had already made the necessary bank movements, withdrawn my share of the savings, and that as of next month, the beach apartment would be entirely under my control. She didn't say a word, only stared at me with a sickening mix of shock and contained anger. I told her I didn't need any explanations. We had talked enough. Now, I wanted to clearly establish the conditions under which I was willing to move forward. I told her I would not let her continue living in this house if she didn't end her double life immediately. If she wanted to keep seeing the other guy, she could, but it wouldn't be under my roof. I told her she could go to her sister's house or rent her own place, but my daughter would not live under a lie, nor would she grow up watching her mother try to maintain two separate stories at the same time. Clara accused me of acting rashly, of reacting as if I were the only one who was hurt. She claimed she was also going through a difficult emotional process, that the situation wasn't so black and white. I told her I wasn't interested in her nuances. When you deliberately drag another person into the equation, you lose the right to ask for empathy from the victim's position. I told her if she wanted to rebuild anything, she would have to start by completely accepting what she had done and severing all ties with that man. Clara was quiet for a few agonizing seconds, then said she didn't know if she was ready to make such a drastic decision. I told her she didn't have to decide today. She could take all the time she needed to think, but in the meantime, she was leaving the house. She was going to her sister's that very night, and I was giving her until the weekend to decide if she wanted to return under the new, strict conditions, or if she preferred to start her new life somewhere else. I made it clear I wouldn't force her hand, but I wouldn't let her continue controlling a situation that had already slipped from her grasp. She stood up and told me she couldn't believe how I was reacting. I told her that was the most ironic thing of all, that after lying to me for weeks, she was surprised by the fact that I was finally acting like a man with dignity. She walked into the bedroom without another word, packed a small bag, came back to the living room, and asked if I was going to explain to Paula why she was leaving. I told her no. That was her job. She created this problem, so she had to explain it. She looked at me, a horrible expression on her face, as if deciding whether to break down crying or simply insult me. Finally, she turned and left without looking back. I closed the door gently, saying nothing. I felt no relief, no sense of triumph, and certainly no peace. I felt only what you feel when you finally do the thing you absolutely have to do, even if it hurts to the core. I sat on the couch, opened my laptop, and started organizing the documents I needed to send to the lawyer. This time, there was no possibility of turning back. The damage was done, and I refused to participate in her pathetic theater for 1 minute longer. On Saturday afternoon, Clara returned to the house while Paula was safely with her grandmother, as we had arranged. I knew she was coming with the intention of negotiating whatever she still imagined was left to negotiate, but I had zero intention of giving her any room to maneuver. Not because I wanted to punish her forever or corner her emotionally, but because everything I had to say was already said. Everything I needed to confirm was already confirmed. Now, the only thing left was to cleanly close a cycle that she herself had destroyed without ever openly admitting the truth. Even though she had no arguments left, she walked in holding a folder. I assumed to show me some document or proposal, and sat down directly at the dining room table, without even a hello, as if pretending a bond existed was no longer necessary. I sat across from her and told her I preferred to speak plainly, that she should tell me exactly what she had come to propose. She said she had talked to her sister, that she had thought deeply about everything we had discussed, and that she believed a legal separation was likely the best way forward for both of us. I was genuinely shocked she said it so quickly, without resistance, without proposing one last desperate plea for reconciliation or repeating the rehearsed speeches from the previous days. I asked her if that meant she had decided to continue things with the other guy. She told me it wasn't that simple, that she didn't know what would happen with that other story, that her head was too messy to decide something so huge right away, but it was obvious there was nothing left between us to sustain cohabitation. I told her I already knew that. I'd been clear about it since the day I chose silence over arguing with someone who didn't even dare to tell the whole truth. Clara looked down, not as a sign of apology, but as if she just wanted to save herself from another confrontation. She stated she wanted everything to be as orderly as possible, that she had no intention of fighting over our assets, and she only wanted to make sure Paula wouldn't be harmed in any way. I replied that sounded fine to me, that I didn't plan on complicating anything unnecessarily either, but that I required all decisions to be finalized in writing and witnessed legally. I no longer trusted her word, not out of pride, but as a basic precaution. She nodded, pulled a couple of pages from her folder, and slid them toward me. It was a draft agreement her brother-in-law, a lawyer, had drawn up, shared custody, an equitable division of assets, and a proposal to negotiate the assignment of the beach apartment. I read it carefully without interrupting. When I finished, I told her I preferred that all future dealings be channeled exclusively through our respective lawyers. It would avoid any misunderstandings or pointless arguments. She agreed immediately, without protest. There was no aggression in the air, only a profound coldness that communicated more than any shouted argument ever could. We were two people who no longer owed each other explanations, only logistical maneuvers. After that, we talked about Paula. I asked her how she planned to explain the separation to her. She said she wanted us to do it together, with a clear, unified message, no excuses, no finger-pointing. I told her that was fair, but I refused to hide the fact that she was leaving out of her own personal choice, and that I hadn't made this decision to break up the family, but because the pretense of a family no longer made sense. Clara tried to soften the narrative. She said it was better to frame it as change, as new beginnings, that sometimes couples simply evolve. I replied that those kinds of vague phrases were for adults who wanted to walk away clean from their messes, but Paula wasn't stupid and would eventually understand everything. The sooner we addressed it with honesty, the better for everyone involved. She didn't argue. She said that sounded fine, and we could do it on Monday after school. I agreed. Before she left, she paused for a moment in the doorway, as if desperately searching for something to say, a final line that would let her exit the scene with some shred of humanity intact. Finally, she asked if I'd ever be able to forgive her. I told her I didn't know, that I wasn't interested in thinking about that right now. Forgiveness wasn't a goal for me. It was something that might come naturally with time, or perhaps never at all. She said she understood. She apologized one last time, but without any real force, like someone repeating a phrase she knew no longer held any power. I opened the door for her. She left without looking back. And that was the last time Clara was in that house as a part of my life. The following weeks were quiet, but they weren't easy. We took turns with Paula according to the provisional agreement drafted by the lawyers and managed to maintain minimal, functional communication. She never brought up the other man again, or her emotional state, or anything personal. I didn't ask her anything either, not out of indifference, but because there was no longer any point in seeking more answers from someone who had proven that her versions of the truth changed according to her own convenience. I focused on my work, on raising Paula, and on fundamentally reorganizing my house and my routine. I changed the locks, replaced some of the furniture, took down old photos from the living room, and packed away memories that no longer had a place. Slowly, day by day, I started to feel better. One Sunday afternoon, while walking with Paula in the park, she asked me if her mom was going to come back home. I told her no, that we lived in different houses now because things between us had changed. She looked up at me with that serious expression kids wear when they're processing something truly significant. She didn't say another word. She just squeezed my hand, and we kept walking. It was in that small moment that I understood I didn't need to explain more than was necessary. The important thing was simply to be present, to respond with stable actions, not with hollow speeches. A month later, we signed the final separation agreement. It was fast, efficient, without incident. Clara was polite, dry, showing neither affection nor resentment, just a long, searching look at the end, as if she was still waiting for me to say something more. But I didn't. Not because I stubbornly refused to, but because there was truly nothing left that made sense to say. We walked out of the office, and each went our separate way. I walked to my car, got in, closed the door, and took a deep, shuddering breath. I didn't feel total relief, but a necessary, final closure. Now, a few more weeks have passed. I live alone with Paula half the time, and the other half I spend quietly reorganizing what I want my new life to be. I haven't thought about Clara with pain or hatred again, only with a kind of mental distance that allows me to finally understand that people change, that sometimes they choose a path without a backward glance, and that you have to either adapt or get miserably stuck in a useless, consuming rage. I haven't even thought about dating anyone, nor do I need to. I'm not racing toward the future, but I'm in no rush either. What I know for certain is that this experience carved a lesson into me that I will never forget. When someone starts lying to you calmly, routinely, and peacefully, the most terrifying thing isn't the lie itself, but the perfect, false peace they build around it to prevent you from reacting in time. And I will never, ever ignore those signs again. Never again. When you've built your entire adult life on trust, how do you learn to trust yourself again after realizing the signs of betrayal were there all along, and you simply chose to believe the lie? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments.